Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Ash Sarkar, covering for Michael Walker, who will be back soon, don't worry. And tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. You've got to say the line, I always say it, it's ladies' night.
Absolutely, it always is when we get such an excellent pairing such as ourselves back again for what seems like a very long time since we last hosted the show together.
They tried to keep us apart, but they will never succeed in breaking up the sisterhood. Coming up tonight, Israel has ordered the evacuation of Rafah ahead of a potential new offensive. France's far-right leader, Marine Le Pen, has been barred from running for president by a criminal court. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump refuses to rule out running for a third term. And your water bills are going up again as Labour sits on the sidelines. The Israeli military has ordered Palestinians in the entire southern Gaza area of Rafah to evacuate or else face the onslaught of Israeli weapons. The last time Rafah was evacuated, it was ahead of the massive Israeli offensive on the area that began 11 months ago. That operation saw thousands of Palestinians killed or injured, while hundreds of thousands more were displaced, despite the International Court of Justice explicitly ordering Israel to halt its offensive on the area. Now, Israel appears to be poised to repeat that violent history. In a post on X, Israel's military Arabic spokesperson Avichai Adraei issued this warning. To all residents of the Gaza Strip located in the areas of Rafah, the municipalities of Al-Nasr and Al-Shawka, the eastern and western regional areas, and the neighborhoods of Al-Salam, Al-Manara, and Kizan al-Najjar, the IDF is returning to fight with great force to eliminate the capabilities of terrorist organizations in these areas. For your safety, you must move immediately to the shelters in Al-Mawasi. Al-Mawasi is the ever-shrinking zone on Gaza's southern coast, which has been repeatedly described as safe by Israel. It isn't. Gaza resident Ahmed al-Najjar told Al Jazeera how his sister sought shelter in Al-Mawasi, only to be killed by Israeli bombs.
She was sleeping in the tent with her family, her children with her, and about 8 people were in the tent with her at the time when the attack happened. The Israelis bombed their entire camp. It's located inside the Al-Mawasi area in western Khan Yunis, the very so-called safe humanitarian zone that the Israelis are directing the people to go to right now. She was sleeping. As soon as the blast and the bombing started, she tried to shield her children next to her and gave her life, basically. She took most of the blast. The shrapnel penetrated through her back and damaged everything, her spinal cord, her abdomen. She was lucky to be transported quickly to the Nasser Hospital, where we thought that she was also lucky having a delegation, a team of American doctors to operate on her, to run her surgery. But even though she had such an expert medical professional, they didn't have the needed equipment. They didn't have the needed supplies to save her, and eventually she succumbed to her wound.
The Rafah evacuation order came this morning during the Eid al-Fitr holiday marking the end of Ramadan. It will see tens of thousands of Palestinians forced to leave an area they were only able to return to 2 months ago. Much of it has been largely reduced to rubble by Israel's repeated assaults on the Strip over the last 18 months. And they'll be joining the thousands told to evacuate the areas along the enclave's borders with Israel and Egypt 2 weeks ago. Israel's slaughter of Palestinians has already begun, with the military also apparently targeting rescue workers. A humanitarian convoy working with the UN has travelled through Rafah in search of 16 first responders missing since last week. 10 Red Crescent workers, as well as 6 civil defence first responders, simply disappeared. But the 5 ambulances, 1 fire truck and a UN vehicle they were travelling in were all struck by Israeli explosives. On Sunday, the bodies of 15 of those rescue workers were discovered. Bulldozers were used to recover the bodies of the first responders, who were found buried in a single grave, still wearing their Red Crescent and Civil Defence uniforms. The Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent say it is the single most deadly attack on its colleagues anywhere in the world since 2017. IFRC Secretary General Jagan Chapagin said this in response to the grim discovery. "I am heartbroken. These dedicated ambulance workers were responding to wounded people. They were humanitarians. They wore emblems that should have protected them. Their ambulances were clearly marked. They should have returned to their families. They did not. Even in the most complex conflict zones, there are rules. These rules of international humanitarian law could not be clearer. Civilians must be protected. Humanitarians must be protected. Health services must be protected." After remaining completely silent about the disappearance of the rescue teams, Israeli forces have now admitted opening fire on the health workers. In a statement, the Israeli military said this: "Several vehicles were identified advancing suspiciously towards IDF troops without headlights or emergency signals. Their movement was not coordinated in advance. Thus, IDF troops opened fire at the suspected vehicles. Following an initial assessment, it was determined that the forces had eliminated a Hamas military operative, Mohammed Amin Ibrahim Shubaki, along with 8 other terrorists from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad." In other words, the Israeli military is maintaining that Hamas and PIJ fighters were using the rescue vehicles as cover. Of course, Israel has provided zero evidence to support this version of events, and it's a pretty handy way of turning protected vehicles into military targets, increasing the risks for rescuers of going into the field to save civilians, meaning more Palestinians die. But even if Israeli soldiers did suspect the vehicles of harbouring combatants, that doesn't give them a right to fire on them indiscriminately. It also doesn't explain how the bodies of the health workers ended up dumped in a mass grave. The Palestinian Red Crescent isn't buying Israel's story. They've described the killings as a premeditated crime and a massacre and have called for an international investigation. Now, it wasn't just the bodies of rescue workers that the humanitarian convoy found while travelling through Rafah. Civilians have also been fleeing the area under gunfire. This is what happened when they came across an injured woman lying in the road, shot in the back of the head.
Can we try just the AVs to advance 50 meters to the front to see the wounded woman?
Robbie 1, no, we will remain here, over.
Yes,
Roger.
another one shot.
Yeah, okay.
What you saw there was the body of the woman lying in the road. A young man attempts to help her, but he is shot too. With new evacuation orders, a ground operation underway, and constant bombardment by Israel, Gaza's need for health and rescue workers is growing. But there are also signs that the Strip is going to become more dangerous than ever for ambulances, fire crews, and other humanitarian workers. Speaking at the UN last week, Britain's permanent representative to the organisation, Barbara Woodward, revealed this.
It's also clear that the space for humanitarians in Gaza, for Palestinians, for aid workers, is significantly reduced. And we also hear that the IDF is no longer accepting deconfliction requests. And this is unacceptable. We have to return to a ceasefire as soon as possible, and that we have to operate in a space that is within international humanitarian law.
Deconfliction requests are how humanitarian and health workers protect themselves from Israeli attacks by announcing their presence and agreeing protected routes through areas where the Israeli military is operating. By refusing to accept new deconfliction requests, Israel is making its message clear. Everyone, from civilians to doctors and from paramedics to aid workers, is a target in Gaza. It's a further sign of the increased pressure Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is placing on the Palestinian population of Gaza. Why? Well, because he wants them to leave. Ethnic cleansing and forcible transfer is the Israeli game plan, and they're doing it in plain sight. Speaking to the Knesset on Israel's renewed assault on the enclave, Benjamin Netanyahu said this: "We are ready. Hamas will lay down its weapons. Its leaders will be allowed to leave Gaza. We will take care of the general security in the Gaza Strip and enable the implementation of the Trump plan, the voluntary immigration plan. That's the plan. We're not hiding it. That's a reference to the plan of US President Donald Trump to empty Gaza of Palestinians, place it under US ownership, and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. And in response to Israel's implementation of that Trump plan, a senior Hamas official has now called for global, potentially violent, resistance. In a statement, Sami Abu Zuri said this: "In the face of this sinister plan, one that combines massacres with starvation, anyone who can bear arms anywhere in the world must take action. Do not withhold an explosive, a bullet, a knife, or a stone. Let everyone break their silence." Helena, I guess I want to ask you specifically about this matter of Israel refusing deconfliction requests. It sort of sounds to me that they've, read the room in terms of the international environment and said, we don't have to maintain any sort of pretense of adhering to international law anymore. Do you think that that's reading the last 18 months and going, we can act with impunity? Or is it a specific response to the Trump presidency?
I think that it's a bit of both, really. I think more likely the latter. I think that there has been an emboldening of Israeli rhetoric, especially amongst members of the government, people linked to Netanyahu and his far-right colleagues in parliament. I do really think that there's a recent emboldening of their future strategy in Gaza, their desire for ethnic cleansing, like the statements that we've seen. Israel Katz saying we're going to take as much territory as we want unless we get total capitulation. These kind of statements that we've seen with regards to their even pretense of international law being upheld, being completely removed. I think that this is a very recent development, and the fact that even the kind of basic level of the desire for the American administration, which of course is the backer of Israel, the Israel Act, with impunity because of its relationship with the American hegemon, when there was at least, there was pushback from the Biden administration. Obviously, it wasn't real pushback, it wasn't material pushback. They didn't stop arming and supporting and facilitating Israel's campaign in Gaza. But at the very least, they feigned the desire to at least give Israel the benefit of the doubt, give them the plausible deniability of, well, I know that we blew up this hospital, or we cleansed this area, or we killed these World Central Kitchen workers or these journalists. There was a plausible deniability because of the links certainly to other groups, and because, of course, we've given these different protections for some people, whether in al-Mawasi or whether it's for humanitarian workers, for example. There was at least this desire to feign that they were doing these things with due diligence, and that the only time they would ever break that if there was a serious Hamas terrorist that they needed to eliminate. That's all gone out of the window, essentially, since the breaking of the ceasefire and, of course, Trump coming to office. And you see that from the rhetoric with regards to Netanyahu. It's no longer we are just trying to ensure that fewer people die, and if you leave, then you won't die. It is, we're implementing the Trump plan. We want to get people out of there. We want to take the territory. This is only going to be happening with a level of recency because of the lack of any kind of scrutiny. I mean, the level that it's, let alone lack of scrutiny, the desire to completely avoid scrutiny at all, and the desire to assist and facilitate this directly rather than indirectly, or at least in the implicit rather than explicit, like it used to be, especially since that they know they have total impunity, because if you speak up against it in the country that is the biggest facilitator of their campaign in Gaza, you get black-bagged off the street. You get thrown into a detention center in Louisiana if you even speak or write an op-ed that opposes America's explicit enabling of the genocide in Gaza. So why would, if you were somebody who was who was part of the Netanyahu administration, if you were somebody who had the power, who again is part of their ideology central to Likud, which is the expansion towards Judea and Samaria being entirely sovereign Israeli territory, like, why would you bother? Why would you bother when you know that the one person where scrutiny even matters, which is your ally, your backer in the United States, when they don't even care, like, why should you keep caring? Why should you bother keeping up that pretense, And of course, there are plenty of their allies outside of the United States who essentially follow the US line on this. They also refuse to actually engage in any kind of changing position, even once they become explicit in their desires. So countries like Germany and the UK, have we engaged in any kind of material pushback? Well, Germany certainly hasn't, and ours has been to the extent of 8% of weapons licenses. Yet we still use, RAF Bryce Norton as a refueling bay for Israeli vessels. Like, at the end of the day, I think that whilst this is certainly part and parcel of the level of impunity that they have been offered up to this point, the change in rhetoric, I think, is purely down to the change in personnel in the White House. Because, again, the implicit has become explicit since the election of Donald Trump.
Marine Le Pen, the head of the French far-right party National Rally, has been barred from standing for the French presidency for 5 years. The ban is part of the sentence handed down to Le Pen after she was found guilty on criminal charges of embezzlement in a Paris court today. She was also sentenced to a 4-year jail term, though 2 years will be suspended and the other 2 served at home under an electronic tag, and she'll be fined €100,000. So, what was Le Pen's crime? She, along with 24 National Rally colleagues, have been found guilty of diverting over €3 million of European Parliament funds via a years-long complex scheme to embezzle the cash. Instead of using the money to pay for parliamentary staff, they illegally used it to pay party staff working for National Rally across France. Le Pen has said she will appeal the verdict, and here's where it gets interesting. The court has agreed to suspend her sentence and her fine pending the outcome of the appeal, but it has said her ban on running in the next presidential election, expected to be in 2027, will have immediate effect and remain in place despite her appeal. And the circumstances leading up to Le Pen's sentencing are likely to lead some to conclude that there's more than a little political motivation behind the ban. Recent polling has consistently projected Le Pen as either the frontrunner in the next presidential election or as having a plausible path to power. But on Friday, just days before today's verdict, France's Constitutional Court ruled in a completely different case that political bans are constitutional under French law. That seems like extremely strange timing, a remarkable coincidence. And other right-wing parties across Europe are seeing the ban as a bad sign for French democracy. This was from Le Pen's likely successor, National Rally's president, Jordan Bardella. Today, it is not only Marine Le Pen who was unjustly condemned, it was French democracy that was killed. Eric Zemmour, leader of the French ultra-nationalist Reconquest Party, said this: "Whatever our disagreements," I started to low down the thing. "It is not up to judges to decide who the people should vote for. Whatever our disagreements, Marine Le Pen is legitimate to present herself to the vote. I regret that politicians have voluntarily given this exorbitant power to the justice system. Everything will have to change." Meanwhile, Russia's Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said this: "Well, indeed, more and more European capitals are going down the path of trampling over democratic norms. Of course, we do not want to interfere in France's internal affairs. We have never done so, and this is France's internal affair. But in general, our observations of European capitals show that they are not at all reluctant to go beyond democracy during the political process." I'll leave you with this last message from Hungary's right-wing president, Viktor Orbán. Je suis marine at MLP officiel. My GCSE French stretches far enough to be able to translate that to I am marine. So it's a pretty motley crew. But it's not just the right who are spotting a democratic deficit in the French court's ruling. It isn't sitting well with the left either. In a statement, French left-wing party France Unbowed said this: "Marine Le Pen and 8 National Rally elected officials were sentenced today for embezzlement of public funds. Their conviction carries an immediate ban on most of them from election. We note that the facts that have been declared true are particularly serious. They completely contradict the slogan, 'Heads up, hands clean,' on which this party has long sought to thrive. We take note of this court decision, even if we refuse in principle that any appeal should be impossible for any litigant, whoever they may be." As for the rest, France Unbowed has never had the option of using a court to get rid of the National Rally. We are fighting it at the ballot box and in the streets through the popular mobilization of the French people, as we did during the 2024 legislative elections. Meanwhile, left-wing leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon said, quote, "The decision to remove an elected official should be up to the people." Joining me now is French journalist and YouTuber Alice Cappelle. Alice, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, first question, what precedent is there for barring someone for running for office in French politics?
This probably is what got the most discourse, the most controversy, the fact that she won't be able to run for president, because as you mentioned in the polls, like she is ranking pretty high. To be honest with you, there's already an announcement that there will be a petition opposing this demonstration, possibly. So this is all happening right now. And this kind of makes sense when you look at the post from someone like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, etc. You can see like they were feeling that this was going to happen, the sort of like democratic backlash after such decision. But since 2016, this has been the law. When there is such accusation of embezzlement or that sort of accusation she's facing at the moment, there is also this measure which prevents you from running to a new for office. So this is the law. This has been consistent in the last few years when there has been similar cases. Marine Le Pen has said the contrary. She said that this is very new, that this is completely disproportionate. Now, if we look at the specifics of this, maybe we could make that argument. But generally speaking, this is not too surprising, the fact that she won't be able to run. Now, obviously, like the accusation of lawfare have been pushed forward by her party, but also by the majority of the politicians or parties on the right of the political spectrum. And attacks such as this is the end of democracy, do we still have a democracy? Some politicians have commented. So this has been sort of the discourse pushed on the right. Now it's interesting to see what the left respond to it. As you mentioned, Jean-Luc Mélenchon has this sort of like more nuanced position. Other people on the left have been very, they've condemned Marine Le Pen actions, and they've welcomed the decision of the justice system. So this is interesting to see how politicians across the political spectrum are positioning themselves in the face of these accusations.
Do you share any of the concerns that this is an example of politically motivated lawfare, or the fact that the law allows for someone to be barred from standing for election? It's something which can be weaponized for the purposes of getting rid of one of your opponents?
I wouldn't say it's not so much that I'm concerned about the lawfare accusation. I'm more concerned about what that means afterwards. I think we could compare the situation happening right now in France to what has happened in the US with the impeachment. You remember they were very much pushed by the Democrats, and because of that, there was a bit of it triggered this backlash, this sort of legitimate democratic backlash from people who supported Trump. And I feel like this is pretty much what is going to happen in France. And I think this is also the reason why some people on the left, including Jean-Luc Mélenchon, are kind of warning against using the justice system, using those practices to sort of, kill your opponents, basically. He wishes that we could kill, or at least fight against those opponents ideologically in the streets, in debates, etc. So I guess the lawfare accusations, if we look again, the law, very strictly speaking, it does fit into the law. Look, it's not outside of the law. But yeah, the repercussions definitely will have political consequences.
I mean, you mentioned that this could backfire politically then, so it could, generate a movement of resentment. Are there overall concerns about the judiciary being politically motivated in France, or is this something which is, solely a talking point disseminated by the right?
Yeah, there are every now and then there are a little bit of accusations that, for example, the magistrate, so the judges syndicate, trade union of judges would be more on the left, and then that lawyers, sometimes are challenging that. So there are those little ideological battles. The truth is, the law that Marine Le Pen is facing, is being accused of not following, was a law that was voted by the parliament, by politicians. It was passed in 2016 by a majority. So this is the result of a political battle as well. This is not the justice system deciding that this candidate is not going to be able to run or this candidate will be able to run. This was voted by the parliament. The parliament gave that power to the justice system to ban people from running for office in cases of embezzlement or corruption. So once again, it's that tricky situation where obviously like the justice system has some sort of, they can interpret things in different ways, etc. But deep down, we're using what parliamentaries, representatives have voted in 2016.
So the offence that Marine Le Pen and others have been found guilty of is diverting EU funds intended for one purpose, to pay for parliamentary staff, and instead using it for paying for party political staff. It sounds a little bit to me like what senior SNP figures have been accused of, including Nicola Sturgeon and her husband Peter Murrell. How unusual is this in French politics, this diversion of funds? Is it a sort of open secret, but people look the other way, or is this actually really egregious?
It is not unusual. It is not unusual. And to be honest with you, just looking at the reactions of different politicians, you can more or less guess, or at least like you can, if you do a little research, you'll see that a lot of them are also in similar situations where they sort of diverted money from the European Parliament or for public funds in general. So our current Prime Minister, for example, his party has also been involved in some of that. Franzen Belde was also accused of being involved in some of that. So let's say it's not something that is unusual. And that's also one of the reasons why Marine Le Pen and her party are saying that this is unfair, that other parties haven't suffered from it as much as they do. I guess like it's political strategy. You see, it's like truth is there's the reality, and then that's how you communicate about it and how you use it to your own for your own political gains.
So I want to talk about the political impacts and repercussions of this now. If Marine Le Pen can't stand in 2027, how are other figures on the left, in particular Jean-Luc Mélenchon, how do they view the idea of going up against Jordan Bardella? Would they be happier? Do they think that he's an easier opponent, or would they be quite worried about it because he's a relatively fresh face?
I think the news might be rather positive in the sense that, as you said, Jordan Bardella is the new face of the National Rally. He's very charismatic. That's probably like his biggest strength. I mean, people can judge like if they find him charismatic or not, but generally speaking, like his charisma has been like presented as an advantage for the party. He's also much more pro-business than Marine Le Pen. So he's much more in the sort of Elon Musk, new Trump, Doge, we're going to help businesses. He made a whole, a few TikTok videos sort of supporting Elon Musk before the Nazi salute episode. And so he's a little bit different from Marine Le Pen, which could be an advantage in some sense, could be a disadvantage in others. Marine Le Pen is obviously the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded the party. So there's also that element of, she's been around for decades. So it's pretty unsure. But to be honest with you, like the left at the moment is also struggling to sort of like figure out like who's going to be. There are a lot of fights within the left at the moment. So even someone like Jean-Luc Mélenchon is not as certain to be the person that the left will present, or maybe there will be different candidates within the left. So they're still sorting out their issues. Obviously, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is trying to keep his position as the leader of the left. But we'll see how all of this will evolve. But personally, I think that he would not be as capable as Marine Le Pen in a situation where he would be in, second round, facing either a left-wing candidate or sort of Macron or someone in the party of Macron.
Alice Cappelle, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Could Donald Trump be planning to find a way around presidential term restrictions? In an interview with NBC News while travelling on Air Force One, Trump was asked whether he would consider seeking a third term in the White House.
You said you were not joking about a third term, about possibly wanting a third term. Does that mean you're not planning to leave office on January 20th?
I'm not looking at that, but I'll tell you, I have had more people ask me to have a third term, which is in a way a fourth term because the 2020 election was totally rigged. So it's sort of a fourth term in a certain way. I just don't want the credit for the second because Biden was so bad. He did such a bad job. And I'm just telling you, I have had more people say, please run again. I said, we have a long way to go before we even think about that.
In the past, when Donald Trump has said similar things, allies of the president have said that he's just trolling his opponents, trying to wind up the libs. When pressed on this by NBC, Trump said this. "I'm not joking," Trump said when asked to clarify, "but I'm not. It is far too early to think about it." When asked whether he has been presented with plans to allow him to seek a third term, Trump said, "There are methods which you could do it." The 22nd Amendment of the American Constitution states that a president cannot be elected to more than 2 terms. It was ratified in 1951 after FDR was elected for a 4th term. Cardi B's favourite president, by the way. To change or abolish the rule, it would take either 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states to agree to hold a constitutional convention. Then, it would have to be ratified by at least 3/4 of the states. But there is a potential workaround. If Donald Trump decided to be someone's vice presidential pick in 2028, say on the ticket with J.D. Vance, he could become president again if his running mate stepped aside after winning the election. Donald Trump said that this was one method that he had in mind, but, quote, "there are others too." This is from NBC News again. Asked to share another method, Trump simply responded, "No." It's one of the reasons why I do, despite myself, I find him quite funny. This is not the first time that Trump has raised the possibility of seeking a third presidential term. This is from an event he did in January at the Congressional Institute.
I've raised a lot of money for the next race that I assume I can't use for myself, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't know. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again?
Helena, last time, Trump was a little bit coy when he was talking about a third term. Do you think that he's becoming more confident about it? What's changed?
And I think broadly when it comes to Trump, I think a lot of people have said this, and people can take what he says with a pinch of salt, but I think that it stands more to his confidence in terms of his power to do what he wants now that he's in office, rather than necessarily his specific desire to manipulate the system to allow him to run again in 2028. I mean, of course, he will also be quite very old when it comes to 2028, or of course 2032, if he does reach the end of a third term, even if he did get to one. So I think that even the Republicans would be a little bit shy on trying to let him do that anyway, or trying to manipulate a ticket with him, say, as the vice president to J.D. Vance, who then stepped aside. I think these things it's pretty far out to be thinking about what his own personal plans are. And he says lots of things without realize what he's saying. We've seen him flip from one thing to the other, calling Zelensky a dictator one week, only to now say he's very angry with Vladimir Putin over how they're negotiating a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. So he's somebody who says lots of things without thinking, says lots of bullshit comments without really understanding the veracity of what he's saying or the impact of whether these things are going to be meaningful in the public discourse. He usually just says any old shit half the time. So do I really think that this is him somehow staking his claim to wanting to run again? He also knows, I don't think it is, he also knows what his voters want to hear. His voters want the Trump dynasty. The MAGA cultists, they are desperate for the Donalds to continue to reign over them. I mean, he described himself as a king. And what I personally believe is a message to those people, the people in America who, despite fighting so hard for a republic, desperately want there to be a monarchy instead of a president. So I think it's more a sign of the power of the Republican Party in office and his strength, given the executive power that he's been allowed to wield since he's been in government. There's been very little pushback at all from both Democrats and from the judiciary over him doing essentially what he wants to do with executive power that he shouldn't have, overriding Congress in plenty of situations, overriding diplomatic and democratic norms every single way you possibly could. Judges go, you can't do this deportation. He goes, well, just try and stop me. Just ignore them. And when he's acting with this level of impunity, with no kind of system to hold him back from doing so, given that it looks like the current institutions in America are so weak and so their claws are so blunt that they can't actually stop him from doing everything that he wants to do. Why would he not feel emboldened? So even if he has no intention of running for a third term, to just talk about violating an amendment of the Constitution, something that he's obviously previously said that he has wanted to undermine the Constitution as well in plenty of other situations, which hasn't stopped his supporters from liking him, even though they market themselves as constitutionalists. The judges he appointed to the Supreme Court market themselves as constitutionalists, right? This is something that he is not concerned with. And again, it's far too early for me to be speculating over his personal desires. But does it show you at the level of strength that he feels that he can do what he wants with impunity? Absolutely.
I mean, look, I know I talk about the Roman Empire too much. I think about the Roman Empire every day, but even under Emperor Augustus, he maintained the fiction that the Senate was still in charge. He was merely the first citizen. It wasn't until Domitian came along that whole pretense was done away with. At the risk of sounding like a sixth form politics teacher, I'm just curious, what do you think about the idea of limits on how many times someone can be elected president or a head of government? Because it's not uncommon in the UK for us to have, maybe 3 back-to-back election wins. Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, definitely. How many times was Wilson? I don't know. Hopefully someone in the comments can tell me. What do you think about it in principle?
Actually, I'm pretty much in favour of term limits. I think when it comes to someone with presidential power, it's very specific. So, of course, any prime minister is entirely curtailed by the fact that they are just essentially the person who has the most amount of direction in terms of where an elected parliamentary government is allowed to use their power. Someone who has a huge amount of presidential power, who is in control of things like the military. You look at, for example, like the French system, where Macron doesn't really have power over the influence of fiscal policy unless he rams it through the amendment, the constitutional power that he has. But what the military is solely in command of Macron. And if you have somebody who has that level of power, who can wield that in the worst possible way, then allowing them to stay in power due to having a dedicated follower base who understand that they can use that executive power with impunity, that you're more likely to see, I guess, I was going to say more likely to see kind of a cult of personality around them. We see that with Trump, regardless of whether there's term limits or not. But I guess the only thing I would put under that is that Trump knows that he can do whatever he wants because he doesn't have to bother seeking re-election unless he tries to run again, That's the one thing that people put to me as the big warning for people who wanted to sit the election out in America, which is that, well, of course, Project 2025 was going to happen in Trump's second term. Because in the first term, he wants to be able to get re-elected, which means he can't just do whatever he wants. He's got to maintain at least the balance of interests for sectors of the population that would then re-elect him. If you have a term limit on somebody, then they are incentivized, I guess, to wield their power as much as they want in their second term, in the knowledge that at the end of the day, once they're out of office, that it's all water under the bridge at that point, because you're not trying to court anybody's votes. The power is centralized within you to do whatever you want to maintain your legacy, rather than trying to maximize your own personal success in future, because you know that there aren't any other elections that you're trying to win. So I think it has its ups and its downs, but broadly I think that there being the necessity for change and avoiding the kind of level of centralized power in one individual figure for too long, I think broadly that's where I stand with term limits, but I understand why people don't like them as well.
See, I love a good sixth form politics discussion. Not all the time on Novara Live, just occasionally. It's not just Donald Trump who's been thinking about creative ways of getting around election rules. Elon Musk, seen here wearing a hat in the shape of a giant wedge of cheese, appeared at a rally in Wisconsin during what has turned out to be the most expensive judicial election in American history. Cheesehead is apparently a nickname for people from Wisconsin because I guess they make a lot of cheese, but I digress. At present, Wisconsin's state Supreme Court has a liberal majority. But that could all change if Judge Brad Schimel, endorsed by both Donald Trump and Elon Musk, is able to defeat Judge Susan Crawford at the ballot box this week. Huge sums of money have been poured into the campaigns of both candidates, more than $81 million so far, with Elon Musk stumping up at least $14 million for Judge Schimmel. Judge Crawford's campaign received millions of dollars from George Soros, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman, and a political action committee set up by Mike Bloomberg. But it doesn't end there. Elon Musk has offered $100 to voters signing a petition against so-called activist judges, and at the rally in Wisconsin, handed out even larger sums of money.
Let me first hand out 2 $1 million checks in appreciation. Okay, so the first check goes to Nicholas Jacobs. All right. Now, I should say that the reason, the reason for the checks is that it's really just to get attention. It's like we need to get attention, and it's somewhat inevitably when I do these things, the sort of it causes the legacy media to like kind of lose their minds. And then they'll run it on every news channel, and I'm like, I couldn't pay them it would cost like 10 times more, or it's to get the kind of coverage that we get. So, all right, thank you so much. You're welcome. Thank you. All right. All right. You can just, I guess, take it if you want. We'll get. I think we'll get you a real one too.
I've also been corrected in the comments. Cheesehead, while also being a nickname for people from Wisconsin, is the nickname of fans of the Green Bay Packers, which is the biggest football team in the state. Not real football, obviously. Stupid American football. Anyway, that was Elon Musk handing out 2 checks for $1 million and boasting about how it's a cheaper way of getting attention than paying for political advertising. Now, in case you're wondering, it is actually illegal to try and buy people's votes, but 2 lower courts in Wisconsin sided with Musk's lawyers, who argued that they weren't bribes and described them instead like this. They are intended to generate a grassroots movement in opposition to activist judges, not to expressly advocate for or against any candidate. Not everyone is as comfortable with Elon Musk's injection of cash into the Wisconsin judicial race. These were protesters assembled outside of his town hall event in Green Bay. One heckler even made it inside the event.
As you may have seen with stuff that we've posted on the Doge.gov website and the Doge handle on the X platform, there is a tremendous amount of waste and fraud in the federal government. Like, shocking, really. It's insane. Yeah, it's really wild. So, it was inevitable that at least a few Soros operatives would be in the audience. Give my regards to George. Say hi to George for me. USA, 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 USA.
I just find it very funny how cognitive dissonance works. So paying voters $1 million during a judicial election is grassroots activism, but an actual protester must be a George Soros operative. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but it sounds just a little bit like projection to me. Elon Musk says that he's invested in the outcome of this judicial race because he objects to judges being able to thwart the will of the president in implementing new laws and executive orders. But there may be other, less highfalutin motivations at play. In January, Tesla filed a lawsuit against the state of Wisconsin as it refused to give Elon Musk's company bypass rules for local car dealerships. Just a few days later, Musk's political organizations began making donations to Wisconsin Republicans. This isn't the first time Elon Musk has tried this tactic. This is from The Guardian. Musk's Political Action Committee used a nearly identical tactic before the presidential election last year, offering to pay $1 million a day to voters in Wisconsin and 6 other battleground states who signed a petition supporting the First and Second Amendments. A judge in Pennsylvania said that prosecutors failed to show the effort was an illegal lottery and allowed it to continue through Election Day. Helena, let's just be really, really real for 1 minute. Would you sign a petition implying that you'd vote a certain way for £1 million?
I mean, if I could not be held legally culpable for doing so and it was something I was going to do anyway, I'll take £1 million from someone who wants to dole out to me regardless. You know, if it's no skin off my nose, if it's something that I had already the intentions of doing. But on like on the serious note, the important thing really here is that, you know, democracy cannot survive the rich. Now, I don't care whether it's Elon Musk, I don't care whether it's George Soros, you know, I don't want rich people influencing elections. I don't want corporations influencing elections. Citizens United is an absolute damning indictment on the state of American democracy, the ways in which corporations are allowed to just buy politicians in America. You've seen people, there's a TikTok account called, I forget what the actual name of it, but he literally starts in, is your member of Congress a piece of shit? Let's find out. And looks through all of their list of donations, all of the PACs that have donated to them, number of stocks that they hold and trades that they've done. And you always see it's the really long-term politicians in America, the ones who've sat in the same seat for decades and decades and decades. They always have the dirtiest campaign finances. They've all got the most corporate PAC money behind them, the large individual donations from people who are unscrupulous. And this is not how democracy should work. The amount of influence that the rich people have on democracy more broadly, this has to be curtailed. And this is why I think this is one of the biggest and strongest arguments that the left has for wealth redistribution. You know, you can always talk about taxes funding government spending, regardless of whether you believe in MMT or not. But people are going to be very, very hard to win over on that metric because they think, well, why does the government need more money? But the framing that you cannot have a system of governance, you cannot have a system electorally that can function in a way that is free and fair, where the rich have huge amounts of control over who gets precedent, who is allowed to be funded in certain ways, the amount of advertising people have access to, and not just in Senate, House, judicial races, comptrollers, the president, but you look at the amount of people in the House, for example, in Democratic primaries, progressive candidates like Jamal Bowman and Cory Bush, who got ousted because of huge amounts of AIPAC money that was thrown into their elections. It just shows you that money in politics has to be curtailed by law if necessary. Of course, not that the law matters to people like Elon Musk, because they'll break it anyway and accuse anybody who tries to undermine them of being an activist judge. Another phrase I fucking despise. I absolutely hate that phrase, because what it implies is that the law as it's written is perfect. There is no problem with the law. And the only reason why we are seeing opposition to what's happening in the Trump camp, for example, is being done by activists trying to undermine the hidden fifth column, trying to get rid of presidential powers, when they're actually just implementing the law as it is and be able to interpret it as it is written to try and curtail the powers, because that's what it should be doing. They get derided. This is exactly what happened in the UK. Remember, we had the Daily Mail, I believe it was the Daily Mail, correct me if I'm wrong, of enemies of the people with 3 judges. Not because they'd done anything they wanted to do. They did their bloody job, which was looking at the law as it was written and then interpreting it with regards to a legal case. You know, if the law is bad, that is not the fault of judges. If you want to change that law, you should go and change it by winning an election. But of course, that's not what these people care about. And of course, you can now buy elections, as we can see with Elon Musk, and also get very little pushback. And when it comes to looking at the kind of Soros-Musk divide, this is why you have this big problem with the liberal ideology that sees money in politics as being a problem only if it's the bad people. You know, you see plenty of people. I remember there was a Liberal Democrat MP on an LBC debate panel talking about how, well, Elon Musk is bad because he uses his money for bad things. But people like Andrew Carnegie and Bill Gates, they were good because they use their money for good things. I'm like, no. Billionaires are a policy failure. Having this much wealth where you can not just distort economics, distort markets, distort the consumption patterns and outbid to the regular working and middle class people for assets, you also distort democracy. You distort the ways in which our politicians act. And this is not a functional way of running a country. This is not responsible statecraft. And it doesn't matter. You know, you may agree with everything that George Soros believes in on like social policy, even though that essentially most of what he believes and supports is a way of trying to get people to avoid the fact that he got rich off the systems of exploitation that lead to the levels of societal problems that he wants to stop through his money. It should not be up to him to decide where that money gets dispersed to how to solve those problems by electing politicians that he wants. No. That money should already be in the public realm. That funding, those resources should already be distributed amongst the people who create that wealth, which is, of course, the working class. And they should be the ones who decide through democratic elections that have finance caps and are done fairly and freely and are not under that influence, right? What is to say that everything that George Soros believes on like social policy is correct? Obviously, me disagree on economics. I'm a communist. Of course, I hate what he believes in economics, right? But even if, say, he supports things that are, broadly kind of about social progressivism, who's to say that he's correct about that and that he should have undue influence to be able to put that into politics? There's no way. You can't say that he can, and he shouldn't be able to, just as Elon Musk shouldn't be able to either. And by liberal types refusing to critique Soros' influence, refusing to be able to combat people like Michael Bloomberg being able to buy huge amounts of electoral advantage through PACs and things like that as well, it undermines the broad opposition to the Republican Party and to Republican politics more broadly, which is they only exist to serve the rich. Right? While the Democrats also exist to serve the rich, at least they have some level of counterweight to that, and that they're funded by trade unions as well in some parts, But it's impossible to be able to put that across to the regular average voter. And same is true with Labour and the Conservatives in the UK, and of course Reform UK as well. Because as soon as there is one party on one side that is claiming to be progressive in a broad sense, but it's taking money from, I don't know, a hedge fund that's based in the Cayman Islands, which are one of the biggest donations they've ever had, that they did a specific time to avoid it being scrutinized before the election, then it just shows that no one can be trusted. And when no one can be trusted because they're all bought out by rich interests, that's when people slide towards the distaste of politics more broadly, which leads to the kind of outcomes that we're seeing where anti-establishment populist right-wing parties are gaining more traction. And that is dangerous for the future of democracy in general. So the main point is we have to get money out of politics, and this should be legislated. We need finance caps, and we need to end Citizens United once and for all.
So Citizens United, they're not a League Two football club. It's a reference to a Supreme Court ruling from 2010, I believe, which basically ruled that corporations could make huge campaign finance donations to the tune of millions and millions of dollars because they've got First Amendment rights. So it's a completely crazy ruling which says a corporation is the same as a person. And so corporations can have political rights the way people have political rights. Completely batshit ruling. If you want to make yourself angry, definitely look it up. As T.S. Eliot said, April is the cruelest month. With the energy price cap going up and council taxes being hiked, many households in the UK will see their expenses mounting at the beginning of the new financial year. Add to that the cost of water. Water bills in England and Wales will rise by an average of £123 a year. Obviously, households can't choose their supplier, meaning that if Anglian Water sticks an extra £100 on your annual bill, you can't just go with a cheaper option. And some companies are taking the piss more than others. Thames Water customers are facing an increase of 31%, meaning that the average annual bill will go from £488 to £639. Out of interest, did anyone at home see their pay go up by 31% in the last year? No? Thames Water is struggling under a debt mountain of £20 billion. Their previous owner, Australian investment bank Macquarie, loaded Thames Water with more than £7 billion worth of debt while paying out massive dividends before selling their stake in 2017. Good riddance to bad rubbish, right? Well, not exactly. They still own a controlling stake in Southern Water, whose bills are going up by significant amounts as well. If you're unlucky enough to be with them, you'll see your bills increase from £478 per year to £703. That's a hike of almost 70%. Southern Water recently had their credit rating downgraded as they've struggled to get on top of a £6 billion debt pile. Since Macquarie sold their stake, Thames Water has since flirted with insolvency. And even though the regulator has given them permission to increase customer bills by up to 35% by 2030, they're still in need of cash. Thames Water argued that they need a 53% rise in order to fix pipes and keep up with demand. But that's not entirely true. This is from The Express. Over a third of customers' bills for water in England and Wales are not used for water and sewerage services, researchers have revealed. An average of 35% of customer bills in 2023-2024 was taken out to pay for the interest on water companies' debt piles and to pay dividends to the shareholders, experts at the University of Greenwich found. So, if your water bill is £600 a year, more than £200 of that is going towards paying for interest on debts and cashing out to shareholders. When water was privatised, there was no debt at all. Now there's more than £60 billion worth of debt across the industry. So much for private sector competence, eh? The actor Steve Coogan, who's been campaigning against water companies pumping sewage into rivers and lakes, said this to BBC Breakfast.
This is a direct result of a 35-year-old experiment in privatisation that has failed because the reason there are toxic algae blooms in the lake and they've been increasing is because of the human sewage, which acts as a fertiliser and makes these algae blooms toxic in the middle of summer. And that is a direct result of the fact that United Utilities don't have the network capacity to deal with it. And the reason they don't have that is because of chronic underinvestment over the last 35 years where all the profits have been paid out in dividends to shareholders and not invested in the infrastructure that's required to keep the lake clean for ordinary people.
Some money has been pledged.
It's getting better. It's getting better. It's a fundamentally broken system. The 35 years, 80 billion has been paid out in customer dividends from all the water utilities in this country. 80 billion over 35 years. 80 billion, and they're talking about spending 75 million quid here and there. It's piffle, it's nothing. The system is broken. Their priority will always be the shareholders. Whatever they say, however many pretty initiatives they have with hosting Green Conference and all the rest of it, the priority will always be their shareholders. I mean, my personal opinion is it should be taken back into public ownership. So any money generated is put into the system. It's the people's lake. This experiment hasn't worked. There's no competition out there. It's a monopoly.
For listeners on the podcast, you can't see that Steve Coogan looks a lot like Jeremy Corbyn at the moment. I don't know if it's just the camera angle or the glasses, but the resemblance is uncanny. Anyway, no wonder more than 80% of Brits, including 70% of Tory and 82% of Reform voters, want to see water brought back into public ownership. That isn't, unfortunately, the Labour government's position. In fact, you might remember that last year they cited analysis paid for by water companies in order to argue against the nationalisation of the sector in England. So the government are out of step with the public when it comes to whether or not to keep water in private hands. But in these increasingly divided times, they have managed to foster a degree of cross-party consensus about one thing. Everyone thinks they're handling the cost of living crisis poorly. This is from recent YouGov polling. 81% of Britons think that the Labour government are managing the cost of living crisis badly. That's pretty much what people thought of the Tories in the immediate aftermath of Liz Truss's prime ministerial disaster class. Now, here's a breakdown of that result by 2024 voting affiliation. You've got more Labour voters and Lib Dems who feel favourably towards Labour, but still a clear majority saying that the government is doing badly. And sure, it's probably no surprise that most Tory and Reform voters think Labour is making a hash of it. But it will probably come as a shock for Labour that so many of their own voters, 2/3, think that the government that they elected not even a year ago is doing such a bad job. So, Helena, do you think that Labour are missing out on easy wins and that they could create some reassurance that they're on the front foot? Or do you have some sympathy with the idea that they've inherited some difficult and complicated economic circumstances that any government would struggle with?
I think there is elements of both. I think that there's a lot of misinformation that Labour have had a poor attempt at trying to push back on. So, for example, no one believes their claim about the £22 billion black hole, which, to be fair, half of that isn't true, but the half of which accounts for departmental overspends from the Conservative budgets that they overtook in July. But basically all of this is true. And the rest of that black hole that they claim was left over is the pay awards they've given to public sector workers. And whilst, of course, I believe that they should be paying these public sector workers, and it was a good thing they did that because it ended all of the industrial action. Trying to market this as something that the Tories left us on, we have to raise taxes, not our fault, rather than making the positive case for why this was important and necessary and why those taxes were necessary. They've not bothered trying to give the positive justification for the policies that they've enacted, and people have just essentially said, well, you've made up some numbers and now you're justifying it, because that's essentially what happened when George Osborne did the same thing in 2010, just with budget cuts rather than tax rises. They've had a lot of problems in terms of the geopolitical economic climate, all of the Trump problems. Everyone kind of said in January when bond yields spiked that it was Rachel Reeves' terrible budget that did this, all of the taxes on the businesses, the poor business owners, they're losing confidence, and this means that bond yields have gone up. And I'm like, no, this was international factors. Otherwise, that would have happened when the budget was announced in October rather than now. So there is some sympathy that I have just in kind of the broad level to which that the economy is in not a great place, and they have inherited a lot of problems that I think people kind of misunderstand in broad popular discussion around what the Labour government have been doing. The problem, of course, is that even if you take those things out, they're also missing out on basically anything that they could do to be able to help the cost of living due to their own fiscal rules that they've imposed upon themselves, which are nonsensical. Even former Bank of England economists have said that it's nonsense to have these fiscal rules and they should change it. Andy Haldane, I said, believe we shouldn't be having fiscal rules that are self-constraining. Their own promises on taxation, those things are constraining themselves in a way that they wouldn't need to. And their own desire for certain kinds of policies has also caused them to look like they don't care. Why would you take money away from the disabled? They say they want to fund the arms increase, the increase in defence budget, and yet they just say, well, the poors can deal with it. And at the same time, in the voters' minds, because there's this zero-sum idea of government spending, that the fiscal rules and the household budget analogy are getting into the public consciousness and the public zeitgeist, where they think, well, if money's going from one area of government spending, then it must be taken from another area of government spending. So the popular narrative at the moment is they're taking money from the poor, the elderly and the disabled, and it's going to migrants in hotels. When, of course, they need to accommodate them whilst their claim is being heard. This is the Refugee Convention. They think that Labour are making the choice to do this when they have to do these things. They have to do these things. And of course, these asylum numbers are so high because caseworkers were cut under the Conservatives, and therefore there's a giant queue for people to get there. So this narrativization has failed them. And then when you come to the things that they could change but are refusing not to for ideological reasons, let's look at the water companies, the main kind of thrust of the argument that was being made in the segment there, which is that they could nationalise them. Steve Reed was on Question Time saying, well, it cost all this money to nationalise them. I'm like, well, it's costing us money to pay the bloody bills right now. It's costing us loads of money to do that. And I understand you've got your fiscal rules, you want to stick to them. But let's be real about the fact that the average person in this country is hurting right now. The people on the bottom rung of the ladder, those are the people who are most affected by rising bills, because they're the ones with which the proportion of their overall income is spent on bills is much higher than people who have very high incomes. So it's disproportionately targeted at those who are the poorest. So that's why they are moving towards reform. Like Reform are polling the highest amongst people who earn less than 20k. They have nothing that Reform UK are offering them. But Labour's promise these people is so terrible that they don't even bother engaging with it and are looking towards some kind of populist alternative. And when you look at, well, why aren't they nationalising it? For example, Thames Water, the biggest offender in these cases, these are people who have liabilities that far outstrip any of their own assets when it comes to, evaluating the share price. You look back what happened with Northern Rock in the 2000s, the Labour government, when they were a little bit more forthright in their desire to do right by the public and weren't running scared of implementing policies that were seen kind of unpopular when it comes to a broad consensus like nationalisation, Gordon Brown just said, no, we're nationalising Northern Rock. People's savings need to be protected. And because their liabilities are greater than their assets, we're going to nationalise them basically for nothing. They took the government to court. The shareholders of Northern Rock took the government to court, and they lost. And the government made to nationalise Northern Rock basically for pennies on the pound, They could do the same with Thames Water due to the egregious levels of over-indebtedness. So they're having to take out huge 9% interest loans just to keep the lights on at Thames Water HQ. And they're trying to expect bill payers to pay for that. This is an insane system that any normal government would be getting rid of. So why? Why aren't the Labour government taking the easy way out? Well, like Novara Media reported before the election, but no one else seemed to care about, their benches are full of people from the lobbying sector. Take, for example, Jade Botterill, the MP for Ossett and Denby Dale. She was somebody who was previously a corporate affairs advisor for Yorkshire Water, a private water company. You look at Water UK, which is a lobby group that represents a consortium of water companies. It's chaired by Ruth Kelly. She was a cabinet minister in the Blair government. There are so many links between the private sector in terms of lobbying and the current people within the Labour Party. And why would they engage in something that is contrary to the interests of the sector for which there are lobbyists for among their benches? Why would they do that? Of course, they're not going to do that. Otherwise, why would they have appointed those MPs in the first place? There is not just an ideological but a material incentive given the people who are the ones who've been shoved onto Labour benches now rather than the candidates they should be having, which is people from blue-collar backgrounds that Labour is traditionally supposed to get into Parliament, have been replaced by suits for corporate interests. So of course they're not going to nationalise the water companies, even though when it comes to the things they do want to spend money on, they're being curtailed by high interest rates and a quantitative tightening program for the Bank of England that's being justified by the fact that inflation hasn't reached the 2% target. And yet the only two things that are increasing in price that are pushing the inflation rate headline to 2.8% are increases in water and energy bills, which aren't being increasing because of some level of high demand, excess demand, giving us a demand pull inflation. It's total greed. It's greed from national monopolies and price gouging and the paying down of insane debts on money that was taken out by water companies to pay off shareholders that go to private equity companies in Australia. This is an insane system that anybody in their right mind would want to rip up for the interests of voters. And yet, even though we are seeing the political capitulation of Labour to Reform UK amongst so many demographics, they don't want to do. And it shows me that there must be something other than their desire to be popular that's getting in the way of that. And you only have to look at the kind of people who they have wanted to have as their MPs on their benches to see why that might be.
I know that this isn't the point of what you said, but it makes me very sad that Denby Dale used to produce record-breaking pies of enormous size, and now they've just got a water lobbyist for an MP. Thank you, Helena, for joining me.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be back with you, Ash, and I look forward to next time.
I'll see you in 6 months, which is when they'll next put us on the schedule together. I'm looking at you, Gary. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.